There is a quiet that settles over a room late at night, after the sounds of the day have finally faded, when the mind, left without distraction, begins to reach for the things it loves and the things it fears losing. Perhaps it reaches for a person whose voice you long to hear again, or a version of yourself you no longer quite recognize, or an outcome that has not yet arrived and may never arrive in the shape you imagined. Perhaps it reaches for a memory, turning it over slowly, as though handling something fragile. In these hours, the body may be still, resting beneath the weight of a blanket, breathing slowly into the dark, and yet the mind continues its quiet work of holding on. It holds on to people, it holds on to plans, it holds on to old versions of who we were and anxious sketches of who we might become. And in all this holding, there is often a subtle ache, a tightness that we rarely notice until we are asked gently to loosen our grip. Long before modern life filled our nights with screens and schedules, human beings lay awake in darkness with the same restless clinging. 25 centuries ago, in the region that is now northern India, a man named Siddhartha Gautama began asking quiet questions about this very restlessness. He was not interested in doctrine for its own sake, and he was not trying to build a religion. He was simply trying to understand why human beings suffer, even when life offers them comfort, even when their circumstances are, by any outward measure, fortunate. He noticed that suffering did not always come from loss itself. It often came from the refusal to accept that loss was possible at all. He noticed that pleasure did not always bring peace. It often brought a quiet fear of the pleasure ending. And in noticing these things, he began to trace suffering back to something quieter and more universal than circumstance. He began to trace it back to attachment. What grew out of his quiet observations was not a single teaching so much as a patient, evolving tradition carried forward across centuries and cultures, refined and reinterpreted many times over, yet returning again and again to the same simple, honest starting point. The details changed. The core observation did not. Somewhere beneath every elaboration, every commentary, every regional variation, remains this same quiet question he first sat with beneath a tree, the question of why the mind grips so tightly, and what might be possible if it learned, gradually, to hold a little more gently. That question is still worth asking tonight, in this quiet, unhurried room, by anyone willing to sit patiently with it for a while, without needing an answer to arrive right away. This is not a reflection about religious instruction. It does not ask you to adopt a belief system, and it does not offer meditation techniques or self-improvement exercises. It is simply an invitation to sit with some old and patient ideas about why we cling and what it might feel like to hold life a little more loosely. You do not need to remember any of it. You do not need to apply any of it. Tonight, you are only being asked to listen, the way one might listen to rain against a window, without needing to understand every drop. Over the course of this reflection, we will move slowly through some of the quiet teachings that grew out of this old tradition of inquiry, not as doctrine to be memorized, but as ideas to be turned over gently, the way you might turn a smooth stone in your palm. We will sit with attachment itself, the mind's tendency to grip what it loves and fear what it might lose. We will sit with craving, the restless reaching that continues even after a desire has been satisfied, always searching for the next condition of happiness. We will sit with impermanence, the simple and difficult truth that everything changes, seasons, relationships, bodies, thoughts, and even the quiet feeling of certainty itself. We will consider what it might mean to love without needing to possess, to care for another person fully, while accepting that nothing between two people can be permanently secured. We will look gently at the idea that the self we take to be fixed and solid is closer to a river than a stone, always moving, always being reshaped by experience. We will notice how thoughts, worries, memories, and fantasies pass through awareness the way clouds pass through an open sky, arriving and eventually dissolving on their own. We will consider the middle way, a quieter path between grasping too tightly and pushing life away entirely. And we will spend time, near the end, simply resting in the present moment, which asks nothing of us beyond our willingness to be here. None of these ideas need to be understood all at once, and none of them need to be remembered by morning. They are simply offered, one at a time, unhurried, the way a single thought might occur to you naturally in the stillness before sleep. Notice, if you can, the quality of your own mind right now. Perhaps it is already reaching toward tomorrow, rehearsing a conversation that has not yet happened, or replaying one that already has, searching for a different ending. Perhaps it is resting on the edge of someone's absence, someone who is far away tonight, or someone who is simply asleep in another room, close enough to touch, and yet somehow still out of reach in the way that another person's inner world is always slightly out of reach. This reaching is not unusual. It is not a sign that something has gone wrong with you. It is simply what minds do, especially in the dark, when the ordinary business of the day is no longer available to distract them. There is a strange comfort in realizing that this pattern is ancient. Long before there were phones glowing in the dark, long before there were calendars filled with obligations, human beings lay in caves and huts and quiet rooms, turning over the same essential worries. Will the ones I love be safe? Will I have enough? Will this feeling last? Will I be remembered? Underneath the specific content of any single night's worry lies this same old question, asked in 1,000 different forms across thousands of years. The question of how to hold a life that keeps moving without holding it so tightly that the holding itself becomes its own kind of suffering. Consider the shape of an ordinary evening. The lights are dimmed. The house grows quiet. And into that quiet steps a parade of small anxieties that seemed manageable during the busyness of the day, but now, in stillness, seem larger than they are. A decision not yet made. A friendship that has grown distant without any clear reason why. A body that does not feel quite as strong as it once did. None of these things are new discoveries. They have likely been present in some form for weeks or months. But it is only in the quiet that they finally have room to be heard, the way a faint sound becomes audible only once the louder noises of the day have faded. This reflection does not intend to solve any of these worries, and it does not offer a method for silencing them. It simply offers a different way of relating to them, borrowed from a tradition that spent a great deal of time studying exactly this kind of restlessness. That tradition suggests, gently, that the worry itself is not the deepest source of suffering. The deeper source is the way the mind grips the worry, turning it over and over, refusing to let it simply pass through awareness, the way weather passes through a valley. Let us begin, then, with the quiet mind that holds too tightly. And let us begin gently, because that is the only way this kind of understanding ever arrives. The heart clings for reasons that are not difficult to understand. It clings because holding on has, at some point, felt like safety. A child who is loved learns to associate closeness with survival, and this association does not disappear with age. It simply changes shape. As adults, we cling to relationships because closeness once meant we were cared for. We cling to certainty because uncertainty once felt dangerous. We cling to success because achievement once earned us approval, or relief, or a sense that we had proven ourselves worthy of taking up space in the world. None of this clinging begins as a flaw. It begins as care. It begins as the mind trying to protect something it values. The trouble, according to the quiet observations of early Buddhist thought, is that care so easily hardens into fear. We begin by loving someone, and slowly, without noticing the shift, we begin to fear their absence more than we appreciate their presence. We begin by enjoying a particular chapter of our life, and slowly we begin to resist its ending more than we enjoy its unfolding. We begin by wanting to do meaningful work, and slowly the wanting becomes anxious, gripping, afraid of failure in a way that steals the very meaning it was trying to protect. Attachment, in this sense, is not simply desire. It is desire that has forgotten how to let the object of its love simply be what it is, changing, temporary, alive. There is no need to judge this pattern harshly. Every human being who has ever loved has also at some point clung. Every person who has ever hoped has also at some point grasped too tightly at the hope. This is not a moral failing. It is simply what happens when a mind that longs for stability meets a world that offers none. And it is worth remembering, especially in these quiet hours, that the goal here is not to stop caring, and it is not to become detached in the cold sense of that word. The goal, if there is one, is to discover a way of caring that does not depend on control. Think for a moment about the particular attachments that tend to visit us most often at night. There is the attachment to being understood, the quiet hope that someone, somewhere, truly sees us as we are, without needing us to explain or defend ourselves. There is the attachment to competence, the fear that if we make a mistake, or fail to perform at the level we expect of ourselves, something essential about our worth will be called into question. There is the attachment to youth, the quiet unease that arrives when we notice in a photograph or a mirror or a moment of unexpected fatigue that time has been moving all along, even when we were not paying attention. Each of these attachments began innocently enough. Wanting to be understood is simply a wish for connection. Wanting to be competent is simply a wish to contribute meaningfully. Wanting to remain youthful is, in part, simply a wish to remain vital and engaged with life. The attachment forms not in the wanting itself, but in the demand that follows the wanting, the insistence that these things must remain exactly as we wish them to be, or else something has gone terribly wrong. It can help, here, to imagine attachment not as a single knot, but as a kind of habit, formed gradually over years, reinforced every time grasping seemed to bring temporary relief. A person who once felt abandoned learns to cling tightly to those who stay. And this clinging, though understandable, can eventually push away the very closeness it was trying to protect. A person who once experienced failure as humiliation learns to grip perfection so tightly that ordinary mistakes become sources of disproportionate shame. These patterns are not chosen consciously. They accumulate quietly, shaped by experience, reinforced by fear, until they feel less like habits and more like fixed features of the personality. And yet, if attachment is a habit rather than a fixed trait, this offers a kind of quiet hope. Habits, unlike permanent features of character, can loosen over time, not through force, but through gentle, repeated recognition. Simply noticing the grip without judgment, without immediately trying to fix it, is itself a small act of loosening. You do not need to dismantle a lifetime of clinging in a single night. You only need to notice tonight that the grip exists, and to let that noticing be enough for now. There is also a quieter form of attachment worth mentioning, one that receives less attention than attachment to people or possessions. This is attachment to a particular narrative about one's own life, the story we tell ourselves about who we are, what we deserve, and how things are supposed to unfold. When life departs from this narrative, even in small ways, it can feel disorienting, as though reality itself has made an error. But reality does not consult our narratives before unfolding. It simply unfolds, indifferent to the stories we have written about it. Loosening our grip on these private narratives, allowing life to right itself in ways we did not anticipate, is perhaps one of the quieter and more difficult forms of letting go, and one that becomes a little easier each time we practice it. The old teachings sometimes describe 3 underlying tendencies that give rise to most of this clinging, often translated as greed, aversion, and confusion, though these words carry a harsher tone in English than they were likely meant to carry in their original context. Greed, in this sense, is simply the pull toward more, the belief that satisfaction lies just beyond what you currently have. Aversion is the corresponding push away, the resistance to anything unpleasant, the wish to avoid discomfort at almost any cost. And confusion is the underlying haze that keeps both of these tendencies running on autopilot, the lack of clear seeing that allows greed and aversion to operate unnoticed, shaping choices and reactions without ever being examined directly. These 3 tendencies are described not as sins to be punished, but as patterns to be understood, the way a doctor might study the underlying causes of an illness, rather than simply condemning the symptoms. Greed is not evil. It is simply an old survival strategy, useful once for securing scarce resources, now often misapplied to situations where more rarely translates into genuine satisfaction. Aversion is not evil either. It is simply an old protective instinct, useful once for avoiding real danger, now often misapplied to ordinary discomforts that pose no actual threat. Understanding these tendencies as old, misapplied strategies rather than personal failings can soften the shame that often accompanies noticing them in yourself. You are not broken for feeling greed or aversion. You are simply carrying inherited patterns that once served a purpose, and that can, with patient attention, be gradually understood and loosened. It can help to notice how these tendencies dress themselves differently depending on what they are attached to. Attachment to pleasure looks like the quiet insistence that a good feeling continue indefinitely. The subtle disappointment when an enjoyable evening winds down. The restless search for the next small comfort once the last one has faded. Attachment to security looks like the need for every variable in life to be accounted for in advance. The discomfort that arises when plans remain open-ended. The relief that follows unnecessarily tight control over circumstances that were never fully controllable to begin with. Attachment to certainty looks like the difficulty of tolerating unanswered questions. The urge to reach a firm conclusion even when the honest answer is simply that you do not yet know. Attachment to success carries its own particular flavor, often disguised as ordinary ambition. It shows itself in the inability to feel satisfied with an accomplishment for more than a brief moment before attention moves to the next goal, the next milestone, the next comparison against someone else's achievements. And attachment to familiar identity, perhaps the quietest of all these forms, shows itself in the discomfort that arises whenever someone sees you differently than you see yourself, or whenever circumstances require you to become someone slightly different than the person you have grown used to being. None of these attachments announce themselves loudly. They tend to operate in the background, shaping choices and reactions long before they are ever consciously named, quietly steering the course of an ordinary life without ever once announcing their presence directly. Simply being able to name these patterns, quietly, without any urgency to fix them tonight, is itself a meaningful first step. You do not need to overhaul your relationship with pleasure, security, certainty, success, or identity in a single evening. You only need to notice, perhaps for the first time with this much clarity, that these patterns exist, that they arose for understandable reasons, and that they are not fixed permanently in place. A pattern that has been noticed even once has already begun to loosen slightly. The way a knot loosens the moment attention is finally brought to it, long before any deliberate effort is made to untie it, patiently, gradually, in its own unhurried time. With this quiet understanding of why the heart clings in the first place, it becomes possible to look more closely at where these old teachings came from, and at the particular life that first gave shape to this way of seeing. To understand why the mind clings so persistently, it helps to look more closely at the young man who first asked these questions with such patience. Siddhartha Gautama was born into privilege, sheltered by his family from illness, aging, and death, in the hope that comfort alone might bring him a contented life. For years, this sheltering seemed to work. He lived surrounded by pleasure and protected from suffering. But eventually, the stories tell us, he ventured beyond the walls of his palace and encountered what every human being eventually encounters, whether sheltered or not. He saw sickness. He saw old age. He saw death. And he saw, in the quiet dignity of a wandering ascetic, someone who seemed to have made peace with all of it. These encounters unsettled him in a way that comfort never had. He began to understand that no amount of pleasure could protect a person from change, and that the very impermanence he had been shielded from was not an exception to life, but its basic condition. This realization led him to leave his palace in search of understanding, not through indulgence, and not through the extreme self-denial he's later tried and rejected, but through careful observation of the mind itself. What he eventually articulated, after years of quiet searching, became known as the Four Noble Truths, and the first of these truths is deceptively simple. Ordinary life contains dissatisfaction. It contains uncertainty. It contains a persistent undercurrent of unease, even in moments that appear, from the outside, entirely fortunate. This is not pessimism. It is closer to honesty. Anyone who pays close attention to their own experience will notice that even pleasant moments carry a faint awareness of their own ending. A beautiful evening with people you love is often shadowed ever so slightly by the knowledge that it will not last. A period of good health is often accompanied by a quiet awareness of the body's eventual decline. This is not a flaw in life. It is simply the texture of a world in which everything, without exception, is in motion. It is worth dwelling, for a while, on what happened next, not as historical curiosity, but because the story mirrors something universal about the human attempt to outrun uncertainty. Comfort, however carefully arranged, cannot indefinitely postpone the basic facts of existence, no matter how much wealth or privilege stands behind it. Eventually, curiosity led Siddhartha beyond the palace walls, and it was there, in the ordinary streets beyond his sheltered world, that he encountered what every human being eventually encounters, regardless of how carefully their own walls have been built. The stories describe 4 encounters, sometimes called the 4 sights, that shaped the direction of his life. He saw an old man, bent and frail, and understood for the first time that his own body, however strong it felt in youth, would eventually follow the same path. He saw a sick man, suffering with an illness that pleasure could not cure and privilege could not prevent. He saw a corpse being carried toward its final rites, and understood, perhaps for the first time, with any real weight, that death comes to everyone, without exception, without regard for status or wealth, or how carefully one has tried to avoid it. And finally, he saw a wandering ascetic, someone who had renounced the pursuit of pleasure entirely in search of a different kind of peace, someone whose calm expression suggested that another way of living might be possible. These 4 sights are sometimes treated as a simple parable, but they contain something worth sitting with more slowly. Aging, sickness, and death are not distant abstractions. They are the quiet backdrop against which every human life unfolds, whether we acknowledge them or not. Most of us, most of the time, arrange our lives in ways that keep these realities at a comfortable distance, filling our days with tasks and pleasures and distractions that allow us to postpone thinking too carefully about impermanence. This is not necessarily a mistake. A person cannot function while dwelling constantly on mortality. But there is a difference between healthy distance and total avoidance, and it is in the space of total avoidance that much of our unnecessary suffering tends to grow. Siddhartha's response to these sights was not despair, though despair might have seemed a reasonable response. Instead, his response was determination, a quiet resolve to understand suffering clearly enough that he might discover, for himself and for others, a way of living that did not depend on ignoring these hard truths. He left behind his position, his family, and his considerable comfort, not out of resentment, but out of a genuine desire to understand something that comfort alone could not teach him. This decision, radical as it was, reflects a pattern worth noticing in our own lives. Sometimes it is only when comfort fails to fully satisfy us, when we sense some deeper unease beneath even our most fortunate circumstances, that we finally begin looking honestly at the nature of our own dissatisfaction. It helps, too, to understand that this dissatisfaction, this dukkha, was never meant to describe only the obvious forms of suffering, the grief of losing someone, the pain of illness, the sharp disappointment of a plan falling apart. The early teachings describe something subtler as well, a dissatisfaction woven into pleasant experience itself, arising simply because pleasant experience does not last. Think of the quiet unease that can accompany even a wonderful evening, a faint awareness that this particular gathering of people, this particular mood, this particular ease, will not remain exactly as it is. This is not sadness exactly. It is closer to a background hum, easy to miss unless you listen closely, and yet present in nearly every pleasant moment once you learn to notice it. There is a third, even subtler layer sometimes described in the old texts, a dissatisfaction that has less to do with any particular experience and more to do with the basic condition of being a changing being in a changing world. Even in moments free of obvious pain, free even of the quiet unease of pleasant things ending, there remains a background instability. The simple fact that nothing about our situation, our body, our circumstances, our relationships, is fixed or fully secure. This is not meant to frighten you. It is meant, instead, to explain why peace so rarely arrives through simply accumulating more pleasant experiences, more security, more certainty. The instability is built into the nature of a conditioned existence, and no amount of favorable circumstance can fully remove it. What can change, however, is your relationship to that instability. And this is precisely where the remainder of this reflection is headed. The second truth builds gently on the first, and it concerns craving, what the early texts call tanha, a word that suggests a kind of thirst, an ongoing reaching of the mind toward what it wants and away from what it does not want. This reaching rarely stops, even when its object is achieved. You may want rest, and when rest finally arrives, you may find yourself restless within it, already reaching toward the next task, the next worry, the next small dissatisfaction. You may want a particular relationship, and once it begins, you may find yourself reaching toward reassurance, toward permanence, toward some guarantee that it will not end. The craving does not disappear when desires are met. It simply finds new objects. This is one of the more unsettling observations at the heart of Buddhist thought, and yet it is offered without cruelty. It is not meant to suggest that desire itself is wrong, or that wanting things is a mistake. It is simply an invitation to notice how rarely the mind rests, even in abundance, and how much of our suffering comes not from lacking what we want, but from the endless, restless movement of wanting itself. Consider for a moment how this reaching operates in ordinary life. A person achieves a long-sought promotion, and for a brief while there is satisfaction. But soon enough, the mind begins measuring the next rung of the ladder, the next comparison, the next reason the present moment is not quite enough. A person finally receives the apology they have been waiting years to hear, and yet the old wound does not close as quickly as they hoped, because the mind has already moved on to some new grievance, some new condition it believes must be met before peace can arrive. This is craving in its ordinary, unremarkable form. It does not announce itself with drama. It simply hums quietly beneath the surface of daily life, always reaching, rarely resting. Notice for just a moment how different this reaching feels from the simple fact of lying here right now. There is nothing to achieve in this bed, nothing to compare, nothing that needs to arrive before this particular stretch of night can be considered acceptable. The reaching mind may still visit, drifting toward tomorrow's obligations or yesterday's small regrets, and that is all right. It is simply being invited gently to notice the contrast between that restless reaching and the quiet, undemanding stillness of the body resting beneath the covers, asking nothing further of the moment than to be allowed to continue. There is an old image sometimes used to describe this pattern, that of drinking salt water to quench thirst. The water offers a brief sensation of relief, but the relief only deepens the thirst that follows. Much of modern life is built, whether by accident or design, around a similar mechanism. A new purchase brings a brief lift in mood, followed by a return to baseline, followed by the pull toward another purchase. A moment of recognition brings a brief lift in confidence, followed by a quiet hunger for the next moment of recognition. None of this is unique to any particular era. The mechanism is simply more visible now, amplified by a world that has built entire industries around understanding and exploiting the restlessness of craving. It is worth noticing, without judgment, how often the phrase "I will be happy" when quietly structures our inner life. I will be happy when this project is finished. I will be at peace when this relationship feels secure. I will finally relax when this uncertainty resolves. Each of these statements postpones peace to some future condition, and yet when that condition arrives, as it sometimes does, the peace it delivers is rarely as complete or as lasting as anticipated. A new condition quietly takes its place. The horizon of satisfaction keeps moving, always a little further away, no matter how much ground is covered. This does not mean that ambition or effort are mistakes, or that wanting a better outcome is somehow flawed. It simply means that peace built entirely on the future arrival of some condition will always remain slightly out of reach, because craving, by its very nature, tends to generate new objects the moment old ones are satisfied. The invitation here is not to stop wanting entirely, which for most people would be neither possible nor desirable, but to notice the reaching itself gently, the way one might notice the current of a river without needing to change its course. The river continues moving either way. The only real choice is whether you stand on the bank watching it pass, or exhaust yourself trying to swim upstream against it. It is worth acknowledging, gently, how much of modern life has been built around this exact pattern of restless craving, whether by accident or by careful design. Entire industries have learned to profit from the gap between one satisfaction and the next, filling that gap with a constant stream of new things to want, new comparisons to make, new small dissatisfactions to notice about a life that, only a short while ago, would have seemed more than sufficient. This is not offered as a criticism of any particular habit or indulgence. It is simply an observation about the environment in which this ancient pattern of craving now operates, an environment uniquely well suited to keeping the reaching in constant motion, rarely allowing it the natural pauses it might otherwise find. Recognizing this does not require rejecting modern life or retreating into isolation. It simply invites a kind of quiet awareness, the ability to notice when a want has been manufactured, rather than arising naturally, when a comparison has been engineered rather than simply observed, when a small dissatisfaction has been carefully cultivated by something outside yourself rather than emerging from any genuine lack. This awareness alone, without any further action required, tends to loosen the grip of craving considerably, the way naming a shadow in the dark often makes it seem far less threatening than it did while it remained unnamed. None of this means peace is unreachable. It simply means peace is unlikely to be found by chasing the next satisfying condition. It is more likely to be found, if it is found at all, in learning to notice the reaching itself without judgment, without the need to immediately act on it. This noticing does not stop the craving from arising. It simply creates a small space around it, a space in which the mind is not entirely swept away by its own momentum. This restless craving is what the early teachings named as the second of the great truths, the origin of suffering, where the first truth simply observes that dissatisfaction is woven into ordinary life. The second truth goes further, tracing that dissatisfaction back to this constant reaching of the mind toward what it wants and away from what it does not want. It is worth sitting with how quietly radical this observation is. It suggests that suffering is not primarily caused by external circumstance, by what happens to us, but by the mind's relationship to what happens, the tightness of its grip, the persistence of its reaching. Two people can face the same loss, the same disappointment, the same uncertainty, and experience entirely different depths of suffering, depending largely on how tightly each mind is gripping what it wishes were otherwise. If dissatisfaction has a cause, the early teachings suggest, then it also has the possibility of ceasing, at least in part, at least in moments. This is the quiet promise contained in the third truth, not a promise of permanent, unbroken bliss, which even the wisest teachers never claimed to offer, but a promise that the grip can loosen, that peace is not permanently out of reach, simply because craving is a persistent feature of the mind. And if this loosening is possible, there must be some path toward it, some way of living that gradually eases the grip rather than tightening it further. This path, gentle and gradual rather than sudden and dramatic, is what the remainder of this reflection will continue to explore. Let us turn now to one of the deepest of these teachings, the truth of impermanence, anicca, perhaps the most quietly radical idea in the entire tradition, and one that touches everything else this reflection has already begun to explore. Everything changes. Every leaf that unfurls in spring will eventually fall. Every relationship, however steady, moves through seasons of closeness and distance. Every mood, however overwhelming it feels in the moment, eventually passes into another mood. Every sensation in the body arises and dissolves. Even the self that seems to persist from morning to night is, on closer inspection, a constantly shifting current of thoughts, feelings, and impressions, rather than a fixed and unchanging thing. This impermanence is not the tragedy it can sometimes feel like at first glance. It is simply the nature of things. Rivers flow, seasons turn, bodies age. Thoughts arise and dissolve like clouds moving across a wide open sky. Suffering deepens, the old teachings suggest, not because things change, but because we expect them not to. We build our sense of safety on the idea that a particular relationship will always feel the way it feels now, or that a particular version of our health, our career, our identity will remain exactly as it is. When change inevitably arrives, as it always does, the suffering we feel often has two layers. There is the simple pain of the change itself, and then there is the additional pain of feeling betrayed by a world that never promised permanence in the first place. Consider the changing seasons, which offer perhaps the gentlest illustration of this idea. Autumn does not grieve the loss of summer. Winter does not resist its own arrival. Each season simply gives way to the next, without protest, without the sense that something has gone wrong. The natural world moves through impermanence with a kind of unforced grace that human beings, burdened by memory and expectation, often find difficult to imitate. And yet in quiet moments, especially at night, when the noise of daily striving has faded, it becomes possible to sense something of that same rhythm within ourselves. The breath rises and falls without needing to be held in place. A thought appears and drifts away without needing to be captured. The body settles into stillness, not because stillness has been forced upon it, but because for a moment nothing is being grasped. There is a particular fear that often accompanies impermanence, the fear that if nothing lasts, then nothing truly matters, that a life built entirely of passing moments somehow adds up to less than a life spent building something permanent. But consider how strange this fear becomes on closer inspection. A song is not meaningless simply because it eventually ends. A conversation is not wasted simply because it eventually concludes. Meaning, it turns out, does not actually require permanence in order to be real. A single afternoon spent with someone you love does not need to last forever in order to have mattered completely while it was happening. What endures, if anything endures at all, is not the moment itself, frozen and unchanging, but the quiet ripple it leaves in how you continue to move through the moments that follow it. Consider, too, the quiet impermanence of the body itself. The hands that once could not hold a pencil eventually learn to write, and later learn other, more demanding tasks, and still later begin to slow, to ache in ways they did not before, to require more care than they once did. This is not a tragedy unfolding. It is simply the shape of a life moving through time, the way a river moves through different landscapes without ceasing to be a river. A person who has made peace with this ongoing change often carries a different quality of presence than one who is quietly fighting it, bracing against every sign of aging, as though it were an insult rather than an inevitability. The same impermanence touches even our most cherished emotional states. A feeling of deep contentment, wonderful as it is while it lasts, does not last indefinitely, and this is not a flaw in the feeling. A period of grief, however overwhelming it feels in its early days, also does not last indefinitely in its original intensity, even though this can feel almost impossible to believe while inside it. Emotions, like weather, move through us. They arrive, they linger for a time, and eventually they give way to other emotions, other weather. Expecting a difficult feeling to last forever creates a kind of despair on top of the original difficulty. Expecting a pleasant feeling to last forever creates a kind of anxious clinging that quietly undermines the very peace it is trying to preserve. Relationships, too, move through this same unhurried impermanence, though we do not always describe it this way. The closeness shared with an old friend in your 20s is rarely identical to the closeness shared with that same friend decades later, and yet something essential often remains, carried forward through all the changes in circumstance, distance, and daily life. A marriage or a long partnership does not remain static either. It moves through seasons of ease and seasons of strain, seasons of deep connection and seasons of quiet distance, the way a long river moves through calm stretches and narrow rapids without ceasing to be the same river. Expecting any relationship to feel exactly as it did in its earliest, most effortless days is like expecting a river to remain in the exact spot where you first admired it. The river was never going to stay still. Its movement was always part of what made it a river rather than a still pond. If you listen right now to the quiet sounds surrounding you, you may notice this same impermanence at a smaller scale. A sound arrives, perhaps the faint creak of the house settling, perhaps wind moving somewhere outside, perhaps only the soft rhythm of your own breath, and then it passes, replaced by another sound, or by silence, which is itself simply another passing texture of the night. None of these sounds ask to be held on to. They arrive, they are heard, and they give way to whatever comes next, the way every other conditioned thing gives way, gently, without struggle, to what follows it. There is a passage sometimes attributed to early Buddhist teaching that compares all conditioned things to a flash of lightning in a summer cloud, brief, luminous, and gone almost as soon as it appears. This image is not meant to diminish the beauty of what passes. If anything, it is meant to deepen our appreciation of it. A flash of lightning is not less beautiful for being brief. If anything, its brevity is part of what makes it remarkable enough to notice at all. Perhaps the same is true of an evening spent with someone you love, or a season of contentment in your life, or even this quiet night itself. Its impermanence does not diminish its value. It may, in fact, be part of what makes it worth attending to so closely. Allow the reflection to rest here for a moment, in this idea of brief, luminous impermanence, without rushing toward the next thought. There is nothing that needs to be resolved about the fact that things change. It is simply true, and there is a kind of rest available in accepting that truth rather than quietly resisting it through the night. This gentle acceptance of impermanence is not resignation, and it is not indifference. It is something closer to trust, a willingness to let each moment be exactly what it is, without demanding that it stay. It is worth turning now to the particular ache of loving another person while knowing, somewhere beneath the surface, that nothing can be permanently secured. This is perhaps where attachment feels most personal, and where the invitation to loosen one's grip can feel, at first, almost frightening. If love does not mean holding tightly, what does it mean? If closeness does not mean guaranteeing someone's presence forever, what remains? The distinction that Buddhist thought quietly draws is between love and ownership. Love, in its clearest form, wishes well for another person without needing to possess them. It delights in their presence without demanding that the presence never end. Ownership, by contrast, treats another person as something to be secured, something whose absence would represent not just sadness, but a kind of personal failure. Much of the anxiety that accompanies modern relationships, the fear of abandonment, the need for constant reassurance, the jealousy that mistakes attention for love, can be traced back to this quiet confusion between loving someone and needing to possess them. This distinction becomes especially tender when applied to the love between a parent and a child. A parent's task, in many ways, is to hold their child closely enough to offer real safety, while simultaneously loosening that hold year by year, so the child can grow into someone increasingly separate, increasingly their own person. A parent who cannot tolerate this gradual loosening, who clings to the earlier closeness of infancy or early childhood as their child grows older and more independent, often creates the very distance they are trying to prevent. Love that insists on staying exactly the same shape, regardless of how the other person is changing, eventually stops fitting the relationship at all. Love that is willing to change shape alongside the person it cares for tends to remain close, even as its form continues to shift across the years. This does not mean that grief has no place here, or that closeness should be approached with detachment. Quite the opposite. A person who has genuinely released the need to possess another is often more present with them, not less, because they are no longer distracted by the fear of loss. They are able to enjoy an evening together without silently rehearsing its ending. They are able to offer support without keeping a tally of what is owed in return. Compassion, understood this way, is not the absence of feeling. It is feeling that has been allowed to move freely, without the tightening grip of ownership around it. Consider how differently two people might sit beside a loved one who is going through a difficult time. One person, gripped by the fear of losing this closeness, may find themselves anxiously trying to fix the situation, offering solutions before they have finished listening, subtly needing the other person's distress to resolve quickly so that their own discomfort can end. Another person, holding the relationship more loosely, may simply be present, listening without an urgent need to fix anything, offering comfort without requiring that the discomfort disappear on any particular schedule. The second kind of presence tends to feel more genuinely supportive, not because the person cares less, but because their care is not tangled up with their own anxiety about the relationship's stability. This distinction becomes especially important in long relationships, the kind that unfold over years or decades. Every long relationship moves through periods of closeness and periods of distance, periods of ease and periods of friction. A person who expects permanence in the form of constant closeness will experience every natural period of distance as a crisis, a sign that something has gone wrong. A person who understands relationships as living, changing things, more like weather systems than fixed monuments, is better equipped to move through these natural fluctuations without panic. This is not the same as tolerating genuine neglect or harm. It simply means recognizing that closeness naturally ebbs and flows, and that this ebbing does not necessarily signal the end of what matters. There is also a particular kind of attachment that arises around the fear of a loved one's mortality, a fear that can quietly shadow even the happiest relationships. This fear, left unexamined, can lead to a strange kind of withholding, a subtle emotional distance kept as a form of protection against future grief. But this protective distance rarely succeeds in reducing the pain of eventual loss. It simply reduces the richness of the present relationship while it is still available. The alternative, difficult as it may sound, is to love fully in the present, precisely because the relationship is not permanent, rather than in spite of that fact. This is not a morbid preoccupation with death. It is closer to a clear-eyed recognition that impermanence, rather than being a reason to withhold love, may be the very reason love matters as much as it does. This willingness to love without possessing connects to a broader quality that the old teachings return to again and again, a quality sometimes called loving-kindness, where ordinary affection is often narrow, reserved for those closest to us, and easily tangled with expectation. Loving-kindness is described as something wider and steadier, a warmth extended simply because another being exists and wishes, in its own way, to be at ease. It does not depend on the other person behaving a certain way, or on the relationship offering something in return. It is closer to the quiet goodwill you might feel toward a stranger who smiles at you on a difficult day. Extended more deliberately, more consistently, toward the people already closest to you. The old teachers sometimes described this quality as a widening circle, beginning close to home and gradually extending outward. It begins, quite naturally, with those you already love without difficulty, family, close friends, anyone whose well-being already matters deeply to you. From there, it can be extended, gently and without force, toward more neutral figures, acquaintances, co-workers, the people you pass without much thought in the course of an ordinary day. And further still, though this stage asks for real patience, it can be extended even toward those you find difficult, not by pretending old grievances did not happen, but by wishing, in some small and honest way, that even a difficult person might find some relief from whatever confusion or pain drives their more difficult behavior. This widening is never meant to happen all at once, and it is never meant to replace the ordinary boundaries that keep you safe from genuine harm. It is simply a direction to lean toward, slowly, across a lifetime, rather than a destination to be reached by morning. There is one more point on this circle, often placed first in the old instructions, though it is frequently the hardest to reach, and that is yourself. Many people find it far easier to wish ease and freedom from suffering upon a stranger than upon themselves, having spent years treating their own shortcomings with a harshness they would never direct at anyone else. But the same understanding that softens judgment toward others, the recognition that behavior arises from conditions rather than fixed flaws, applies just as fully to you. You, too, are a temporary, ever-changing process, doing the best you can with the understanding available to you at each particular moment. Extending this same warmth toward yourself is not indulgence. It is simply completing the circle, rather than leaving yourself, quietly and habitually, on the outside of it. Alongside this loving kindness sits compassion, a related but distinct quality, one that responds specifically to suffering, rather than simply to existence. Compassion notices when another person is struggling, and wishes gently for their struggle to ease, without needing to fix it, without needing to rush toward a solution before the suffering has even been acknowledged. This is different from pity, which often carries a quiet sense of distance, of looking down at someone else's difficulty from a position of safety. Compassion, in the sense meant here, recognizes a shared vulnerability, an understanding that the same forces of aging, loss, and uncertainty that visit another person will, in time, visit you as well. This shared vulnerability is not a cause for despair. It is, in its own quiet way, a source of connection, a reminder that no one moves through this changing world entirely alone. It is worth noticing how naturally compassion arises once the grip of self-protection loosens even slightly. A person consumed by anxious self-concern, constantly guarding their own image, their own comfort, their own certainty, often has little spare attention left for genuine concern about others. But as that grip softens, even briefly, attention becomes more available, more capable of noticing when someone nearby is struggling, more willing to offer presence without needing anything in return. This is one of the quieter gifts of letting go. It does not simply ease your own suffering. It makes more room for you to be present with the suffering of others, not as a burden to be managed, but as an ordinary part of being close to people you care about. Grief deserves special mention here, since it is often misunderstood as evidence that letting go has failed, that attachment has simply been proven right after all. But grief and letting go are not opposites. Grief is what love looks like once its object has changed form, once presence has become absence. A teaching of non-attachment does not ask you to feel less grief when someone you love is gone. It simply offers a different way of carrying that grief, one that does not require endless resistance to the fact of the loss itself. The pain of missing someone is not the same as the additional suffering that comes from insisting somewhere beneath the pain that this loss should not have happened, that reality has made some unforgivable error by allowing someone impermanent to actually prove impermanent. Softening this second layer, the resistance to loss itself, does not remove the grief. It simply allows the grief to move more like weather and less like a permanent, unmovable weight. This same gentleness can be extended toward smaller losses as well. The quiet grief of a friendship that has faded, a chapter of life that has closed, a version of yourself that no longer exists. These losses rarely receive the same acknowledgement as more dramatic ones, and yet they carry their own quiet weight. Allowing yourself to grieve them without judgment, without needing to minimize their significance simply because they seem small compared to greater losses, is itself an act of the same open-hearted honesty this whole reflection has been gently pointing toward. There is a kind of freedom, hard-won and quiet, in loving someone the way you might watch a bird resting briefly on a branch outside your window. You do not own the bird. You did not summon its arrival, and you cannot guarantee its return. And yet, for the moment it is there. You are fully present with it, grateful without grasping, attentive without demanding. This is not a lesser form of love. If anything, it may be a more honest one, because it does not depend on circumstances remaining unchanged in order to feel safe. There is another teaching that sits quietly beside the teaching of non-attachment, and it is important because people sometimes imagine that letting go means becoming distant. The old Buddhist traditions did not generally point toward distance. They pointed toward a softer kind of closeness, one that is less tangled with fear. Compassion begins with a simple recognition. Every person you meet is carrying some invisible burden. The stranger passing you on the street, the friend who seems cheerful, the person who once hurt you, the younger version of yourself who made mistakes. Each is trying, in their own imperfect way, to move through a world that changes constantly. When the mind is tightly attached to its own desires, it has little room left for this recognition. Much of its energy is spent protecting, comparing, defending, and acquiring. But when the grip loosens, even slightly, attention becomes more spacious. It notices the humanity of others more easily. Imagine a candle in a dark room. If the flame is shielded too tightly by the hand that fears losing it, the hand begins to ache. When the hand relaxes, the flame is not diminished. Its light simply has room to spread. Compassion is like this. It is not possession. It is not control. It is the quiet wish that another being may find some ease in the midst of their changing life. This wish can arise without effort. It may arise when you remember someone who is struggling tonight. It may arise when you think of a person you have not spoken to in years. It may arise even toward yourself, which is often the most difficult direction of all. Many people find it easier to forgive others than to forgive themselves. They carry old errors like stones in their pockets, turning them over again and again in the dark. But the same impermanence that applies to all things applies to those moments as well. The person who made that mistake no longer exists in exactly the same way. Time has already changed them. To see this clearly is not to erase responsibility. It is simply to stop treating a single moment as the whole of a life. Compassion, then, is not sentimental softness. It is clear seeing joined with kindness. It is the understanding that all beings are vulnerable, all beings are temporary, and all beings are trying, however clumsily, to find some measure of peace. There is a quiet relief in no longer needing anyone, including yourself, to be perfect before they are worthy of gentleness. Perhaps that relief can be felt faintly, even now, in the stillness of this night. Closely related to compassion is the teaching of loving kindness, sometimes described as a friendliness toward life itself. This friendliness is not excitement. It is not enthusiasm. It is more like the warmth of a small lamp that continues burning steadily through the night. The old teachings often describe loving kindness as something that can widen gradually, beginning with those who are easy to love and extending outward little by little. First toward those already dear to us, then toward acquaintances, then toward strangers, and eventually, with great patience, even toward those with whom we have difficulty. This widening is not a command. It is a direction of the heart. Notice how attachment tends to narrow attention. It divides the world into what is mine and what is not mine, who supports me and who threatens me. Loving kindness gently softens these boundaries. It does not erase discernment or healthy boundaries. It simply allows the heart to become less contracted. Think of rain falling over a landscape. It does not choose only the beautiful trees. It falls on the wild grass, the stones, the fields, and the forgotten corners alike. Loving kindness has something of this quality. It is not earned. It is offered because life itself is difficult enough. Even a brief moment of this wider friendliness can change the texture of the mind. The chest feels less tight. Thoughts become less sharp. The world appears less adversarial. And perhaps one of the quietest forms of loving kindness is simply allowing this moment to be enough, without demanding that it become something else before it is worthy of peace. The room is already quiet. The night is already here. The breath is already moving gently in and out. Nothing further needs to be added for this moment to be complete. As Buddhist traditions matured across centuries, many teachers returned again and again to a surprisingly simple observation. Much of human suffering is intensified by excess. Excess of possessions, excess of stimulation, excess of comparison, excess of ambition that has forgotten how to rest. Simplicity in this context does not mean owning nothing or withdrawing from ordinary life. It means learning the difference between what genuinely nourishes the heart and what merely keeps the mind occupied. A quiet meal eaten with attention may nourish more deeply than a lavish meal eaten in distraction. A single honest conversation may nourish more deeply than many superficial ones. A few moments of real stillness may nourish more deeply than hours of restless entertainment. Modern life often encourages the opposite assumption, that more is automatically better. More information, more options, more experiences, more productivity, more achievement. Yet the mind rarely becomes peaceful through accumulation alone. Often it becomes more crowded. Imagine a lake continually disturbed by stones thrown into it. The water has no opportunity to become clear. Simplicity is not the forceful removal of every stone. It is the gradual reduction of unnecessary disturbance. Late at night, this becomes easier to understand. The world has already simplified itself. Many of the day's demands have fallen silent. The room contains only a few things. The body lies still. The breath continues without effort. In such moments, it becomes possible to sense that peace may be less a matter of acquiring something new, and more a matter of allowing what is unnecessary to settle. The old teachers often lived with very little, not because little was morally superior, but because they discovered that a mind surrounded by fewer distractions could more easily notice what had always been present. The same possibility exists in a small way, even here tonight. You do not need to simplify your entire life before sleep arrives. You only need this one quiet moment. And this moment is already remarkably simple. There is one final teaching worth lingering with before the reflection comes to rest. Beneath the movement of thoughts, there is often a quieter background that we overlook because we are so fascinated by the thoughts themselves. A memory appears, a plan appears, a worry appears, an image appears. And then, after each has passed, something remains. The old contemplatives sometimes became interested not only in the contents of the mind, but in this remaining silence. Not a dramatic, mystical silence, just the ordinary silence that is present before a thought arises and after it fades. You may notice it now in very small intervals, the brief pause between one thought and the next, the tiny opening before the mind begins another sentence. These openings are easy to miss because they are so simple, yet they reveal something important. Awareness is not identical with any particular thought. Thoughts move through it the way birds move through the sky. The sky is not damaged by their passing. This recognition can bring a deep kind of rest. If thoughts are visitors rather than permanent residents, then they do not need to be feared quite so much. They can arrive, stay briefly, and depart without requiring endless engagement. The silence beneath them remains. Listen for a moment to the quiet of the room. Perhaps there is a distant sound somewhere beyond the walls. Perhaps there is only stillness. Even sounds arise within a larger silence and return to it. In the same way, thoughts arise within awareness and return to quietness. Nothing needs to be forced. Nothing needs to be stopped. The night is already doing its patient work. And perhaps, very gradually, the mind can begin to trust that it does not need to hold itself together every second in order for life to continue. The breath continues, the body rests, the darkness remains gentle around you. And beneath the changing weather of thought, there is a quieter space that has been here all along. To understand why letting go feels so difficult, it helps to look closely at another quiet teaching, one that can seem, at first, more abstract than the others, though it is deeply woven into the same fabric. This is the teaching of non-self anatta, the observation that the self we take to be solid and continuous is, in fact, far more fluid than it appears. Consider for a moment how much you have changed over the course of your life. The person you were as a child held beliefs, fears, and preferences that may seem almost unrecognizable now. The person you were a decade ago may have clung to certainties that have since quietly dissolved. Even within a single day, your mood shifts, your energy shifts, your opinions on small matters shift depending on how rested or how tired you are. And yet, through all of this change, there persists a felt sense of being one continuous self, a narrator who has been present through every version. Buddhist philosophy does not deny this felt sense of continuity, but it gently questions whether there is a single, fixed, unchanging essence underlying it. What we call the self may be closer to a river than a statue, a continuous flow of thoughts, sensations, memories, and impressions, rather than a solid object that remains the same from moment to moment. This is not meant as a discouraging idea. It is, in its own quiet way, liberating. If the self is not a fixed thing, then it does not need to be defended so fiercely. It does not need to be proven, protected, or permanently secured against every threat to its image. It can be allowed to shift, to grow, to be shaped by experience without that shaping feeling like a loss. Think about the roles you have occupied over the years, each one requiring a slightly different version of yourself. The self that shows up at work, careful and measured, is not identical to the self that laughs easily with old friends, or the self that softens completely in the presence of a child, or the self that appears only in the privacy of your own thoughts late at night. None of these are false selves pretending to be the real one underneath. They may simply be different expressions of the same fluid process, arising according to circumstance, the way water takes the shape of whatever container holds it without ceasing to be water. This fluidity extends even to the beliefs and opinions we hold most firmly. A conviction that once felt unshakable in your 20s may look different by the time you reach your 40s, not because you were foolish before, but because understanding itself is a living process, continuously revised by new experience. A person who insists on defending every past belief with the same intensity, refusing to let any part of their earlier thinking evolve, often finds themselves increasingly rigid, increasingly disconnected from the actual complexity of the world they are trying to describe. There is a kind of freedom in allowing your own views to change, in recognizing that intellectual growth requires letting go of certain earlier certainties, much the way a plant must shed its earlier leaves in order to keep growing. This same fluidity offers a quiet kindness toward the parts of yourself you may be least comfortable with, the moments of impatience, the old mistakes, the versions of yourself that acted from fear rather than clarity. If the self is not a fixed, permanent thing, then these moments were not expressions of some unchanging flaw at your core. They were simply expressions of a particular set of conditions, a particular state of mind, arising at a particular time, already passing even as they occurred. This does not excuse harmful behavior or remove the need for accountability. It simply offers a gentler frame for self-reflection than the harsh, permanent judgments the mind so often reaches for. You are allowed to have acted poorly once without that single moment defining the entirety of who you are capable of being. This is, perhaps, one of the gentler ways to understand why so much suffering centers around identity. We cling to a particular image of who we are, successful, competent, admired, needed, and any change that threatens this image feels like a kind of small death. But if identity is understood as something fluid rather than fixed, these changes become less threatening. They become simply part of the ongoing flow of a life that was never meant to remain still. Consider, too, how much energy is spent maintaining a consistent self-image in front of other people. There is a quiet exhaustion that comes from needing to always appear a certain way, competent in every circumstance, unaffected by every difficulty, consistent across every mood and setting. Loosening the grip on a fixed self-image does not mean abandoning integrity or authenticity. It simply means allowing yourself the same permission you would extend to anyone else, the permission to be inconsistent, to contradict your past self occasionally, to be uncertain sometimes and confident at other times, without treating every inconsistency as evidence of some deeper flaw. Closely related to this fluid sense of self is another quiet observation from the same tradition. The idea that nothing exists entirely on its own, separate and self-sufficient. Every person, every thought, every moment of experience arises in dependence on countless other conditions. A single meal on your table depended on soil, rain, the labor of people you will never meet, and years of accumulated knowledge about how to grow and prepare food. A single thought in your mind depended on a lifetime of language, memory, and experience that shaped how that thought could even take form. This is sometimes described as dependent arising, the recognition that everything is woven into everything else, that the boundary we draw around a separate, independent self is, in some sense, a convenient simplification rather than an absolute truth. This idea can sound abstract, but its practical implications are quietly significant. If you are not, in fact, a separate and isolated self, but rather a temporary pattern woven from countless other influences, then your well-being was never entirely separate from the well-being of those around you in the first place. The strict boundary between self-interest and concern for others begins to soften. Caring for another person becomes less like an act of sacrifice and more like a natural extension of caring for the larger web of relationships you are already part of. This does not require any grand philosophical conclusion. It simply invites a slightly wider way of understanding where you end and the rest of the world begins. A boundary that, on closer inspection, was never quite as fixed as it seemed. Even the quiet act of resting here tonight depends, in its own small way, on countless conditions beyond your own making. The people who built this room, the generations of accumulated knowledge that allow you simply to lie down and expect to wake again tomorrow. None of it entirely your own doing, and none of it needing to be. The old teachings sometimes break this fluid sense of self into 5 loosely gathered streams, offered not as a rigid formula, but as a way of looking more closely at what we usually lump together as me. There is the physical body, changing constantly, cell by cell, breath by breath. There are sensations, the raw feeling of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral that colors every experience before thought even arrives. There are perceptions, the mind's habit of recognizing and labeling what it encounters, turning raw sensation into this is a chair or this is my friend's voice. There are the ongoing mental formations, the habits, intentions, and emotional tendencies that shape how we respond to what arises. And there is consciousness itself, the simple awareness that knows all of the others are happening. None of these 5 streams, examined closely, holds still long enough to be called a fixed self. Each is a process, not a possession. And yet together, flowing in relationship with one another, they produce the vivid, convincing sense of being a continuous person that we rarely think to question. This way of looking does not ask you to conclude that you do not exist, which would be its own kind of strange overcorrection. It simply asks you to notice that what exists is more like a weather system than a monument, more like a flame passed from candle to candle than a single unchanging object. A flame at the end of the night is not identical to the flame that was lit at the beginning. And yet there is a continuity, a relationship between each moment of burning and the next. Perhaps this is closer to what we actually are, not a fixed thing enduring unchanged through time, but a continuous, ever-renewing process, related to what came before, open to what comes next, and never quite the same from one breath to another. There is another image, gentler still, sometimes used to describe this same fluid identity, the image of a wave upon the ocean. A wave rises, takes on a distinct shape, briefly appears separate from the water around it, and then subsides back into the larger body it was never truly apart from in the first place. No one mistakes the wave for something permanently separate from the ocean. Its brief, distinct shape is simply the ocean, moving in a particular way, for a particular while. Perhaps the self is something like this, a temporary shape taken by a much larger, ongoing process, distinct enough to have its own particular experience, its own particular joys and sorrows, and yet never entirely separate from the wider flow of life it arose from and will eventually return to. This is not a cause for sadness. Waves are not diminished by returning to the ocean. If anything, their brief particular shape was always simply the ocean's own way of dancing for a while in the sunlight. Late at night, this fluidity becomes easier to sense, because the mind is not as occupied with maintaining its usual defenses. Thoughts arise without the same urgency they carry during the day. Worries drift past without demanding immediate resolution. Memories surface and recede, unbidden, unforced. In these hours, it becomes possible to notice thoughts the way one might notice clouds moving across a night sky, arising from some unseen source, drifting for a while, and eventually dissolving without leaving a permanent mark. This is perhaps one of the gentlest practices offered by contemplative traditions, though it asks for no particular technique or effort. It simply asks for a willingness to observe rather than to control. A worry arises, and instead of immediately following it down every branching path of what if, the mind is invited to simply notice its presence, the way one might notice a cloud passing overhead. The worry does not need to be silenced. It does not need to be fought. It is enough to notice that it has arrived, and to trust that, like every cloud, it will eventually pass. There is a subtle but important difference between having a thought and being consumed by it. A thought that arises and is simply noticed, without elaboration, tends to move through awareness fairly quickly, much like a single cloud drifting across an open sky. But a thought that is seized upon, examined from every angle, argued with, defended against, tends to gather other thoughts around it, the way a single cloud can gather into a larger and more persistent weather system. Much of what feels like unbearable mental noise at night is not caused by the original thought itself, but by the elaborate structure of related thoughts that gets built around it once the mind begins gripping rather than simply observing. Memories work in much the same way. A memory surfaces, perhaps a small regret, perhaps a moment of tenderness long past, and instead of clinging to it or pushing it away, it can simply be allowed to move through awareness, the way weather moves across a landscape, without asking permission, and without needing to be stopped. This is not indifference to one's own inner life. It is closer to a kind of hospitality, welcoming each thought as it arrives, without needing to keep it forever, and without needing to banish it before its time. Fantasies about the future can be met with this same quiet hospitality. A daydream about some hoped-for outcome, a rehearsal of some anticipated conversation, a vivid imagining of how things might unfold. These are not problems to be solved. They are simply more clouds, arising from the same source as every other thought, equally temporary, equally without the need to be gripped or resolved before the mind is allowed to move on. Even anxious fantasies, the kind that spiral toward worst-case scenarios, can be met this way, not by forcing them to stop, which rarely works, but by recognizing them as passing weather, rather than accurate predictions of what is to come. Regret deserves particular gentleness here, since it is often one of the heaviest visitors to arrive in the quiet hours before sleep. A choice made years ago, a word spoken too harshly, an opportunity allowed to pass unclaimed. These can return again and again, each time carrying the same familiar weight. But regret, examined closely, is also simply a thought, arising from memory, colored by present understanding, that was not available to you at the time the original choice was made. This does not mean the regret is meaningless, or that the past no longer matters. It simply means the regret does not need to be relived in its full intensity every time it surfaces. It can be acknowledged, met with the same quiet hospitality offered to every other passing cloud, and allowed to continue moving rather than being seized upon and turned over indefinitely. There is a difference, too, between remembering and reliving. Remembering allows a past event to be present in awareness without pulling you fully back into its original emotional intensity. Reliving pulls you entirely into that earlier moment, as though it were happening again, right now, with all its original weight intact. Much of the exhaustion that comes from dwelling on the past stems from this reliving, rather than simple remembering. Learning to notice the difference, gently, without forcing anything, is itself a form of the same practice this whole chapter has been describing. The practice of allowing thoughts to be present without being consumed by them. Throughout all of this, the breath remains a quiet, steady companion, present beneath every passing thought, every drifting memory, every restless fantasy. You do not need to control it. It has been moving in and out since before you could form a single thought, and it will continue moving long after any particular worry has passed. When the mind feels especially crowded, especially full of clouds gathering too closely together, it can help simply to notice this breath, not to change it, not to deepen it deliberately, but simply to notice that it is here, patient and unbroken, offering a kind of quiet ground beneath all the weather passing above it. The breath does not ask you to resolve your thoughts before it continues. It simply continues, rising and falling, regardless of what the mind happens to be doing at any given moment. There is something worth noticing about the particular quality of attention this practice requires. It is not a tense, effortful vigilance, watching thoughts the way a guard watches for intruders. It is closer to a relaxed, spacious awareness, the way one might sit outside on a clear evening, simply watching the sky change color without needing to do anything about it. This kind of attention is available to you right now, in this quiet room, with the weight of the blanket settled around you, and the sounds of the night moving somewhere beyond the walls. You do not need to chase this awareness. You only need to let your attention soften enough to notice it is already here, between the extremes of grasping tightly and pushing away entirely. Early Buddhist thought offers what has come to be known as the middle way. This teaching emerged from the Buddha's own experience, having lived first in extravagant comfort and later in severe self-denial, neither of which brought him the peace he was seeking. Indulgence left him restless and unsatisfied. Harsh asceticism left him weakened and no closer to understanding. It was only in finding a quieter balance between these extremes that clarity began to emerge. This middle way is not a compromise in the sense of settling for less. It is closer to a recognition that both grasping and rejecting are, in their own way, forms of tension. To grasp at pleasure is to live in fear of its absence. To reject pleasure entirely, out of fear of attachment, is simply another kind of clinging, this time to the idea of detachment itself. The middle way suggests something softer than either extreme, a way of living that neither pursues experience with desperate hunger, nor pushes it away with anxious avoidance. It is closer to simply being present with whatever arises, pleasant or unpleasant, without the added layer of struggle. Siddhartha's years of extreme asceticism are worth pausing on, because they illustrate how easily even the pursuit of spiritual understanding can become another form of grasping. During this period, he reportedly reduced his food intake to almost nothing, pushing his body to the edge of collapse, believing that suffering itself might be the doorway to enlightenment. But this severe self-denial did not bring him closer to peace. It brought him closer to death, and no clearer understanding of the mind's restlessness. It was only when he accepted a simple offering of food and allowed his body the nourishment it needed that he began to sense a different path forward, one that required neither excessive indulgence nor excessive denial, but a kind of steady, sufficient care. The story tells us that his fellow ascetics, who had practiced alongside him for years, felt a quiet betrayal when he accepted that simple meal, believing he had abandoned the difficult path in favor of an easier one. They did not yet understand that he had found something more difficult than either extreme, a steady middle ground that required no less discipline than harsh asceticism, only a different kind of discipline, one aimed at balance rather than at conquest. It was only after this meal, restored and steady, that he is said to have sat beneath a large fig tree and remained there through a long night of quiet observation, until by morning something in his understanding had settled into place. This lesson applies just as readily to ordinary daily life as it does to spiritual seeking. Consider how the same imbalance shows up in smaller ways. A person exhausted by overwork may swing toward complete avoidance of responsibility, only to feel adrift and purposeless in the absence of any structure. A person who has overindulged in comfort may swing toward harsh self-discipline, punishing themselves for perceived laziness, only to find this harshness unsustainable and eventually collapsing back into the very indulgence they were trying to escape. The middle way suggests a steadier alternative, neither collapsing into excess nor tightening into severity, but finding a sustainable rhythm that can be maintained without constant strain in either direction. In ordinary life, this might look like enjoying a good meal without needing it to be perfect, or enjoying a quiet evening without needing it to last forever, or facing a difficult conversation without either avoiding it out of fear or forcing an outcome out of anxiety. It is a way of engaging fully with life while holding it, always, with a slightly open hand. There is a quiet discipline required to maintain this middle position, though it does not resemble the discipline of willpower or restriction. It is closer to the discipline of continual, gentle correction, the way a sailor continually adjusts a small tiller to keep a boat moving steadily through changing winds, rather than locking the tiller in one fixed position and hoping the wind cooperates. Some days will lean slightly toward indulgence, other days slightly toward restraint, and neither lean needs to be treated as failure. The middle way is not a single fixed point to be permanently achieved. It is more like a continual, gentle returning, again and again, to balance. Out of this middle way grew a broader set of quiet guidelines for living, sometimes described as an eightfold path, though the number itself matters far less than the spirit behind it. These guidelines were never meant as strict commandments handed down from above. They were offered more as gentle observations about which ways of living tend to ease suffering, and which ways tend to deepen it. There is a suggestion toward clear understanding, seeing situations as they actually are, rather than through the distortion of fear or craving. There is a suggestion toward wholesome intention, wishing well rather than harm, even in small everyday moments. There is a suggestion toward honest and kind speech, noticing how easily words can wound or heal, and choosing, where possible, the words that heal. There is a suggestion toward considerate action, living in a way that causes as little unnecessary harm as possible to yourself and to others. And there is a suggestion toward a livelihood that does not require compromising these same values simply to earn a living. None of these guidelines ask for perfection. They ask instead for attention, a willingness to notice when speech has been careless, when action has been driven by fear rather than clarity, when intention has drifted toward self-interest at the expense of others. This attention is not meant to produce guilt. It is meant to produce a kind of gentle course correction, the same continual returning to balance that defines the middle way itself. A person who speaks harshly in a moment of frustration is not condemned by this teaching. They are simply invited to notice the harshness, to understand where it came from, and to choose differently the next time the opportunity arises. There is something worth noticing about how these outward guidelines connect back to the inward work of letting go of attachment, a mind that grips tightly to its own comfort, its own certainty, its own need to be right, often finds itself speaking carelessly, acting selfishly, choosing paths that serve short-term relief over long-term well-being. As the grip loosens, even slightly, these outward patterns tend to soften as well, not through forced effort, but as a natural consequence of a mind that is no longer so consumed by its own anxious self-protection. Ethical living, understood this way, is less a matter of following rules, and more a matter of allowing a quieter, less grasping mind to express itself naturally in how you speak, how you act, and how you move through your relationships with others. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes something that can otherwise feel like a burden. Living kindly, honestly, and considerately is not primarily a discipline imposed from outside. It is closer to what naturally emerges once fear and craving loosen their hold on the mind. You do not need to force yourself to be kind if kindness is simply what remains once the anxious grasping has quieted. This does not happen all at once, and it is not achieved through a single night of reflection. But each small loosening of the grip tends to make the next kind word, the next considerate action, a little more natural, a little less effortful than it was before. There is a short saying, attributed across many versions of the early teachings, that captures something of this connection between inner peace and outward kindness. The observation that peace comes from within and should not be sought without. It is a simple line, easy to hear and easy to forget, and yet it quietly undercuts so much of how modern life is arranged, structured as it often is around the belief that peace will finally arrive once external circumstances are sufficiently controlled, once enough has been acquired, once enough uncertainty has been eliminated. The old teaching suggests something gentler and in its own way more hopeful. Peace was never waiting somewhere out there, contingent on circumstances finally cooperating. It has always been available closer than that, in the quality of attention you bring to whatever circumstances happen to be present. Acceptance, understood this way, is not the same as approval, and it is not the same as passivity. Accepting that a difficult season of life is happening does not mean pretending it is welcome, and it does not mean abandoning any effort to improve what can genuinely be improved. It simply means no longer spending additional energy fighting the plain fact that this is what is currently happening. There is a subtle but important difference between working to change a difficult circumstance and refusing to acknowledge that the circumstance exists in the first place. The first is often necessary and constructive. The second tends only to add a second layer of suffering on top of whatever difficulty was already present. Consider how differently a closed door feels, depending on how it is met. A door closed with resentment, endlessly revisited in imagination, reopened again and again in bitter what-if scenarios, continues to cause pain long after the actual event has passed. A door closed with acceptance, acknowledged honestly for what it was, grieved if grief is warranted, and then allowed to remain closed, eventually stops causing fresh pain with each remembering. The door itself did not change in either case. What changed was the relationship to the door, the willingness to let a completed chapter actually be complete. This same acceptance extends naturally to endings of all kinds: the end of a job, the end of a friendship, the end of a particular chapter of health or vitality, even the quiet, ordinary ending of each single day. Endings are not failures of a life poorly lived. They are simply what every beginning eventually becomes, the way every sunrise eventually becomes a sunset, without this being considered any kind of tragedy. A life fully lived is not a life in which nothing ever ends. It is a life in which each ending is met with enough honesty and enough tenderness that it can be released rather than endlessly carried forward, unresolved, into everything that follows. There is something worth pausing on here, a quiet observation many people eventually make, sometimes only after years of searching for it elsewhere. Peace rarely arrives through acquisition. It rarely arrives because a particular goal was finally achieved, or a particular possession was finally obtained, or a particular relationship was finally secured. More often, peace arrives in brief, unplanned moments, when the grasping simply stops, even if only for a while. Perhaps it happens while walking alone through quiet woods, with no destination in mind and no urgency in the step. Perhaps it happens while listening to rain against a window, with nothing that needs to be accomplished in that particular hour. Perhaps it happens in the stillness just before sleep, when the mind, exhausted from its usual reaching, simply allows itself to rest. In these moments, there is often a sense of sufficiency, a feeling that nothing more is needed, even though nothing has actually been acquired. This suggests something quietly important. Peace may not be a possession to be pursued, but rather the natural state of the mind when it is not busy grasping at something else. This does not mean grasping must be eliminated entirely, or that a person must achieve some permanent state of non-attachment in order to know peace. It simply means that peace tends to arrive in the gaps, in the pauses, in the moments when striving briefly loosens its hold. And these gaps are more available than they might seem, especially at night, especially in stillness, especially when there is nowhere left to rush toward. There is a certain kind of silence that carries this quality especially well, the silence that settles after a long day, once the last small task has been abandoned for tomorrow, and there is nothing left to do but simply exist within the hour. Many people find this silence uncomfortable at first, having grown so accustomed to constant stimulation that stillness itself feels almost unfamiliar, even faintly unsettling. But if the discomfort is allowed to pass, without immediately reaching for a phone, a thought, a distraction of any kind, something quieter often emerges underneath it, a kind of spaciousness that does not need to be filled. Nature seems to offer this same quality of peace almost effortlessly. There is a reason so many people describe feeling calmer after time spent near water, or beneath trees, or beneath a wide open sky filled with stars. It is not simply the change of scenery. It is that the natural world does not ask anything of the person observing it. A tree does not require your attention in order to keep growing. A river does not pause its flow to wait for you to catch up. In the presence of something so entirely unconcerned with your striving, the mind is given quiet permission to stop striving as well, if only for a while. Ordinary stillness, the kind available in your own home on an unremarkable evening, holds this same potential, even without the dramatic backdrop of mountains or oceans. The quiet hum of a house settling for the night, the soft weight of a blanket, the distant sound of wind moving past a window. None of these require anything from you. They simply are, patiently, without demand. And in their presence, it becomes possible to notice that you too do not need to be doing anything right now in order to be all right. There is a particular kind of gratitude that tends to arise naturally once grasping loosens, quite different from the effortful gratitude sometimes prescribed as a technique for improving one's mood. This gratitude is not manufactured by listing things you are supposed to appreciate. It simply appears, unbidden, once attention is no longer entirely consumed by wanting something else. A warm blanket becomes, briefly, remarkable, simply for being warm. The sound of steady breathing becomes, briefly, remarkable, simply for being present. This is not a technique to be practiced diligently. It is more like a natural byproduct of a mind that has, even briefly, stopped reaching past what is already here. Simple presence of this kind does not require any special circumstance. It does not require a retreat into nature or a period of formal quiet, though both of these can certainly support it. It is available in an ordinary bedroom, on an ordinary night, to anyone willing to let their attention rest here rather than reaching elsewhere. This availability is itself worth noticing. Peace was never hidden behind some distant achievement. It was always available closer than that, in the willingness to stop reaching, even for a few quiet minutes before sleep. If moonlight happens to be finding its way into the room tonight, tracing a pale line across the floor or the edge of the bed, notice how little it asks of you. It does not require your attention in order to keep shining. It arrives from a source unimaginably far away, travels in silence across an unimaginable distance, and settles quietly here, on this particular floor, in this particular room, without any need for acknowledgement. And if there is rain instead, soft against the roof or the window, notice how it too continues without waiting for permission, each drop arriving and dissolving into the next. A small, steady, uncomplicated rhythm that has been repeating itself in one form or another since long before you were born, and will continue in one form or another, long after this particular night has ended. There is a kind of companionship available in this, even in the ordinary sounds of an ordinary night, a reminder that you are not alone in the quiet, even when the quiet feels, for a moment, very large. Much of human suffering, when traced back to its root, involves the mind living somewhere other than the present moment. Attachment to the past shows itself as regret, nostalgia, or the quiet ache of comparing what is to what once was. Attachment to the future shows itself as anxiety, planning that never feels finished, and a persistent sense that peace is always one achievement away. Both of these forms of attachment share a common feature. They pull awareness out of the only moment that is actually available to be lived. Consider how rarely the mind actually rests in the present without some pull toward elsewhere. Even in a pleasant moment, a small part of attention often drifts toward what comes next, or toward some comparison with a similar moment in the past. This is not a character flaw. It is simply a well-worn habit, built over years of needing to plan ahead in order to survive and function in a complicated world. But the habit, however useful in certain contexts, carries a cost when it becomes constant, when it leaves no room for the mind to simply arrive where the body already is. There is a small, quiet experiment worth noticing, rather than performing, since nothing here asks for effort. If you simply let your attention rest for a moment on the sensation of your own body against whatever you are lying on, the slight pressure of weight, the faint warmth gathering beneath the blanket, you may notice that this sensation carries no story with it. It does not remind you of yesterday. It does not warn you about tomorrow. It is simply here, uncomplicated, asking nothing of you beyond the noticing itself. Thoughts will likely return soon enough, reaching once again toward past or future, and that is entirely fine. There is no failure in the reaching. There is only the quiet option, always available, of returning again to this simple sensation, this simple breath, this simple moment. The present moment, by contrast, asks nothing of you. It does not require you to have already succeeded, and it does not require you to have already resolved every uncertainty about what comes next. It simply is what it is, complete in itself, whether it contains comfort or discomfort, clarity or confusion. This night, exactly as it is, with its own quiet, its own weight of blankets, its own rhythm of breath, is already enough. Nothing more needs to be added to it in order for it to be complete. There is a simplicity to this present moment that can be easy to overlook precisely because it asks for so little. It does not require achievement. It does not require resolution. It only requires your attention gently offered, without any particular goal attached to the offering. The sound of your own breath, slow and steady, is already here, without needing to be summoned. The weight of the blanket against your body is already here, without needing to be earned. The darkness of the room, whatever small light might be filtering in from outside, whatever quiet you can hear beyond these walls, all of it is already here, complete, asking nothing further of you. This is, perhaps, one of the gentler forms of freedom this whole reflection has been circling toward. Not freedom from feeling, and not freedom from thought, but freedom from the constant need to be somewhere other than here. This freedom is not achieved once and kept forever. It is returned to again and again, each time the mind notices it has wandered into past or future, and gently, without frustration, brings itself back to the simple fact of this moment, exactly as it is. There is no finish line to this returning, and that is, in its own quiet way, a relief. You are not being asked to master presence, the way you might master a skill, and then set it aside as complete. You are simply being invited to notice, tonight and on other nights like it, that the present moment is always available, always patient, always willing to receive your attention the moment you are ready to offer it. Tomorrow will bring its own reaching, its own planning, its own necessary attention to what lies ahead. But tonight, none of that is required. Tonight asks only for this. This is, perhaps, one of the more difficult ideas to fully absorb, not because it is complicated, but because the mind is so habituated to reaching elsewhere. And yet in quiet moments like this one, it becomes possible to sense the truth of it, even briefly. There is nothing that needs to be resolved tonight. There is nowhere that needs to be reached tonight. There is only this moment, unfolding exactly as it is, asking nothing more of you than your willingness to be present within it. Everything this reflection has touched on so far has, in its own way, been leading quietly back to this same simple point. As this reflection draws toward its close, it is worth returning to where it began, to the quiet hours when the mind reaches for what it loves and fears losing. Perhaps, having sat with these ideas for a while, that reaching feels slightly less urgent now. Perhaps the grip has loosened, even if only a little. Think back for a moment over everything this reflection has quietly touched, the way attachment so often begins as ordinary care before hardening into fear. The honest observation, offered by a man who once sat beneath a tree, searching for understanding, that ordinary life carries a persistent undercurrent of dissatisfaction, and that this is not a flaw to be ashamed of, but simply the texture of a changing world, the restless reaching of craving, always searching for the next condition of happiness, never quite satisfied by the last one, the deep, patient truth of impermanence, that everything moves, seasons and relationships, and thoughts, and even our own sense of who we are. The possibility of loving fully without needing to possess, of caring for someone precisely because they will not always be here, rather than despite that fact. The fluid, ever-changing nature of the self, more river than statue, more process than fixed thing. The gentle practice of letting thoughts pass like clouds, observed rather than seized. The steadiness of the middle way, neither grasping nor rejecting, continually returning to balance. The quiet ethical guidelines that arise naturally once fear and craving loosen their hold. The recognition that peace is rarely acquired, and more often simply uncovered, in the gaps where striving briefly rests. And finally, the completeness of this present moment, asking nothing more of you than your willingness to be here within it. None of these ideas need to be carried forward with any effort. They were never meant to become another task, another form of self-improvement to measure yourself against. They were simply offered, the way a friend might offer a quiet observation during a long walk, without expecting you to remember every word, trusting that whatever is useful will remain in its own way, and whatever is not needed will simply pass, the way every other thought passes through the mind in the course of an ordinary night. There is an old image sometimes used to describe this shift, the image of holding life with an open hand rather than a closed fist. A closed fist can hold on to something tightly, but it can also receive nothing new, and it tires quickly from the effort of gripping. An open hand can still hold what it values. It can still cradle something precious, but it does so without strain, without the exhausting fear of loss that comes from clenching too tightly around what was never fully ours to keep in the first place. Picture this open hand for a moment, resting easily at your side, palm turned slightly upward, fingers relaxed rather than curled. Nothing has been dropped. Nothing has been abandoned. The hand simply holds differently now, lightly enough that whatever rests within it, a relationship, a hope, a memory, a plan for tomorrow, can be seen clearly, appreciated fully, and released without a struggle whenever its season naturally comes to an end. Nothing needs to be forced away tonight. You do not need to release every attachment, solve every uncertainty, or arrive at some final understanding before you are allowed to rest. It is enough, for now, to simply notice the grip and to let it soften, even slightly. The people you love do not need to be held so tightly in order to be cherished. The plans you carry do not need to be gripped so anxiously in order to matter. The identity you have built does not need to be defended so fiercely in order to be worthy. Everything continues to change, the way it always has, the way it always will. The night deepens, the breath slows, thoughts continue to drift, arising and dissolving, like clouds crossing a dark and quiet sky. And within all of this movement, there is a kind of stillness available, not because change has stopped, but because you are no longer straining against it. There is no need to remember any particular phrase from this reflection, no line to hold on to, as though it were a lesson that must be retained. If anything remains by morning, let it simply be a faint, wordless sense that the grip can loosen, that this is possible, that peace does not require the world to stop changing in order to be found. Everything else, every specific idea, every image of rivers and clouds and open hands, can be released along with everything else this reflection has gently invited you to release. The understanding, if it has taken root at all, will remain in its own quiet way, whether or not you can recall a single sentence that helped it grow. The way a seed remains rooted long after the gardener who planted it has forgotten the exact afternoon it was placed in the soil. Somewhere beyond these walls, the night carries on with its own quiet business, indifferent and patient, the way it has every night before this one. Perhaps there is wind moving through unseen trees. Perhaps there is rain, soft and steady, tracing its way down a window somewhere close by. Perhaps there is only silence, deep and unhurried, the kind of silence that asks nothing of you except your willingness to rest inside it. Whatever sound or stillness surrounds you now, let it simply be what it is, without needing to name it, without needing to do anything about it at all. Let the hand open gently, without force. Let whatever is here tonight simply be here, without needing to be held in place forever. Let the mind rest in the wide and changing flow of life, the way a leaf rests on the surface of a slow-moving river, carried along without struggle, without needing to know exactly where the current leads. There is nothing more that needs to happen tonight. There is only this quiet, this breath, this gentle unfolding of a moment that was never meant to be grasped, only lived. And within that simple understanding, held loosely without strain, there is a kind of peace that no amount of holding on could ever quite provide. Rest now, if rest is what your body is asking for. And if sleep has not yet arrived, let that be all right too. There is nowhere else you need to be, and nothing else you need to hold. Only this moment, open-handed, unfolding quietly into whatever comes next, exactly as it should, exactly as it always has, exactly as it will continue to, long after this particular night has finally, gently come to its own quiet close. Come back now, gently, to the room, to the particular dark that surrounds you, not empty, but full in its own quiet way, full of soft shapes and familiar corners, and the steady, unhurried passage of a night that is under no obligation to move any faster than it already is. To the blankets, wherever they happen to be resting against you, taking on, by now, almost the exact shape of your body, as though the two of you have reached some small, wordless agreement to hold each other for a while. There is nothing left to resolve tonight. Everything explored so far, the clinging, the craving, the shifting self, the passing clouds, the wide and patient sky beneath them. None of it needs to be remembered correctly. None of it needs to be understood completely. None of it needs to be carried forward as a task for tomorrow. It has simply been offered, the way a friend might offer a thought during a long, unhurried conversation, not as instruction, but as company. Picture, if it helps, a hand, your own hand, resting somewhere on the bed, or tucked beneath a pillow, or simply lying open at your side. Picture it clenched, the way a fist closes around something it is afraid to lose, knuckles pale, fingers aching faintly from the effort of holding on so tightly for so long. This is not a shameful image. Almost every hand at some point has held something this way: a person, a memory, an idea of who you are supposed to be, a fear disguised as vigilance. The fist was never cruelty. It was protection, learned honestly at some point, for some real reason. But a fist held long enough grows tired. The muscles ache. The grip, however well-intentioned, begins to cost more than it protects. And so, gently, without force, without any dramatic gesture, picture that same hand beginning to open. Not thrown open. Not flung wide in some sudden release. Simply, slowly, unclenching, the way a hand does naturally when it finally remembers it is allowed to rest. This is the whole of what has been offered tonight, wrapped inside a single, small image. Not the demand that you let go of everything you love. Not the suggestion that caring is a mistake, or that peace requires becoming someone colder, more distant, less invested in your own life. Only this. An open hand can still hold things. It simply holds them without strangling them. It can still hold a person, a hope, a memory, a version of yourself you are proud of. And it can do all of this without the exhausting fear that letting the grip soften, even slightly, means losing everything at once. Nothing needs to be forced away tonight. Not one worry, not one memory, not one fear about tomorrow. If something is still circling, let it circle. It is allowed to be here. The way weather is allowed to move through a sky that was never in any danger from it. You do not need to win an argument with your own mind before you are permitted to rest. You do not need to arrive at peace through effort, the way you might complete a task correctly. Peace, if it comes tonight, is more likely to arrive the way it always seems to, quietly, in the gaps between trying, in the moments the grip loosens simply because it finally remembers that it was allowed to all along. There may be, even now, some particular thing the mind keeps returning to beneath all of this, some specific worry or person or fear that feels too important to simply let soften along with everything else. That is allowed too. This reflection was never asking you to release everything indiscriminately, as though all attachments were equally light, equally easy to loosen. Some things are held more tightly than others for good reason, and they may still be held tonight, carefully, tenderly, even as the wider grip around everything else begins to ease. Letting go, if it happens at all, rarely happens all at once, in every direction, on command. It tends to happen unevenly, a little here, a little there, whatever is ready moving first, and whatever is not ready being allowed to wait, without judgment, for whatever night it finally feels ready to soften on its own. So if one particular thing remains held tightly tonight, that is not a failure of this reflection, and it is not a failure of you. Let it be held. Let everything else, all the smaller, more incidental tensions gathered across an ordinary day, be the ones that soften first. The larger things can take longer. They are allowed to. Remember, if it helps, and only if it helps, that everything examined tonight was pointing toward the same soft center. That the heart clings because it cares, and that caring was never the problem. That craving keeps reaching because it was taught somewhere along the way that satisfaction lives just past the next acquisition, when it may have been available all along in the noticing of what is already here. That everything changes, the seasons, the body, the people you love, the very sense of who you are, and that this was never a betrayal, only the ordinary shape of being alive inside time. That thoughts are not commands, only weather. That the self holding all of this together may be less like a statue and more like a river, continuous, moving, never quite the same water twice, and no less real for all of that movement. That the fear living inside someone else's grip on you deserves the same patience you would want, extended to your own. That grief, wherever it moves through you, is simply love that has not yet found a new place to rest, and that it is allowed to take exactly as long as it needs. None of this needs to be believed perfectly. None of it needs to be remembered by morning. It only needs to be allowed to rest here for a while, in the quiet space where the mind slows down enough to stop defending its old positions so fiercely. Perhaps somewhere in the stillness, there is a faint sound worth letting yourself notice, without searching for it. The settling of an old house, the distant, muffled passage of wind against a window. a clock somewhere, marking time in a way that asks nothing of you, simply continuing, the way the whole night continues, indifferent and unhurried, and quietly good company for anyone still awake inside it. These sounds do not need to be identified or explained. They are only further proof that the world keeps turning gently around you, unbothered, holding its own steady rhythm, whether or not your mind has settled yet into its own. The room is still dark. The blankets are still holding their quiet, familiar weight. The breath continues, unattended, patient, exactly as it has all along, in and out, asking nothing of you except, perhaps, to be noticed every now and then, briefly before attention wanders off again toward sleep, or toward some soft, half-formed thought, or toward nothing at all. There is no correct place for your attention to rest right now. There is no failure waiting if it wanders. There is only this slow, unhurried unclenching, happening at whatever pace it happens to happen, on its own schedule, in its own time. Let the open hand rest now, exactly where it is. Let it hold what it holds, lightly. Let it release what it is ready to release, without ceremony, without needing to announce the releasing to anyone, not even to yourself. Somewhere beneath the thoughts still moving through the room, there is a stillness that was never disturbed by any of them. A wide, unbothered sky that has been here the entire time, holding every passing cloud without ever once being changed by it. You do not need to reach for that stillness. Reaching for it would only be another form of the same old grip, wearing a gentler costume. It is enough to know it is there, underneath everything, the way the sky is still there underneath even the thickest, greyest cover of cloud, patient, unmoved, waiting for nothing in particular, because it was never missing anything to begin with. The night continues around you, indifferent in the kindest possible sense, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply present, the way it has been present for every other person who has ever lain awake inside it, holding too tightly to something, and slowly, eventually, letting their grip soften into sleep. You are not doing this alone tonight, even in the quiet. Every person who has ever loved someone and feared losing them, every person who has ever clung to a version of themselves that no longer fit, every person who has ever tried to hold a changing life still with sheer force of will, has passed through some version of this same unclenching at some hour very much like this one. Somewhere else, in this same darkness, someone else is also lying still, also holding something too tightly, also unaware that the hand is even clenched until a moment like this one gently points it out. You are not unusual for having held on so hard. You are, if anything, simply human, in the oldest and most ordinary sense of that word, shaped by the same instincts that have shaped every person who ever loved something enough to fear losing it. There is a quiet companionship available in this thought, if you let it settle. The clenching was never a private failure. It has always been part of what it means to be a person, in a body, in time, loving things that do not last forever. And so the unclenching, when it comes, is not a private triumph either. It is simply the next natural step in a very old, very human pattern, one that has been completing itself quietly, night after night, for as long as there have been minds capable of holding on, and hearts eventually tired enough to let them rest. There is nowhere further to go tonight. There is nothing left to solve, nothing left to prove, nothing left to secure against the passage of time before you are permitted to rest. The open hand does not need to accomplish anything. It only needs to remain open, softly, letting whatever is ready to pass through it pass through, and letting whatever remains simply remain, held without strain, cared for without fear. Let the shoulders settle a little further into whatever is holding them. Let the jaw soften once more, in case it has quietly tightened again, without your noticing. Let the eyes rest, heavy now, in the dark. There is nothing more to understand tonight, and nothing more that needs to be done. The thoughts may keep moving for a while yet, softly, distantly, like a light rain that has mostly passed, leaving only the occasional drop. Let them. They are not the sky. They were never the sky. Somewhere in this stillness, the grip is already loosening, gently, on its own, in whatever small way it is ready to. Not because you forced it, not because you finally solved something, only because it was tired, and it is allowed at last to rest. The room stays quiet. The breath continues, unattended, easy. The open hand rests where it rests, holding nothing too tightly, releasing nothing by force, simply present, simply here, in the last soft moments before the mind finally stops reaching altogether and lets the night hold you instead. There is only this, the dark, familiar, and unafraid. The breath, slow and unattended. The open hand, resting. And beneath all of it, patient and unchanged, the wide, quiet sky that was never disturbed, not once, by anything that ever passed through it. Whatever tomorrow holds will still be there in the morning, ready to be met with whatever fresh attention a rested mind can offer it. It does not need to be solved tonight. It does not need to be planned for, guarded against, or held in place by a mind that has already given enough of itself to this one long day. Tomorrow can wait. It has always been willing to. And so, for now, there is only the room, and the dark, and the slow, unattended breath, and the open hand, resting a little more easily than it was resting an hour ago. There is only the quiet, patient sky, holding everything, disturbed by nothing, exactly as it has always been, exactly as it will still be tomorrow night, and every night after that, whenever you find your way back to it. Nothing more needs to happen now. Nothing more needs to be understood, decided, or held on to. The night will keep its own quiet watch from here. Rest now. There is nothing left to hold.